I'm probably going to have to apologise. I'll start at some point.
I'm going to hit record so don't say anything embarrassing.
Okay.
Right.
Can you ready?
No. So, welcome to our EKIS panel discussion, the semi-formal part of the day. Perhaps everyone would like to briefly introduce themselves. Start with Nick.
I'm Nick Ray from Australia. I head up the Ethical Consumer Group, which is a group that produces a buying guide, an annual supermarket buying guide, and a website, and we run workshops and basically try to communicate the idea that we have the ability to make better choices in our everyday purchases.
I'm Ellis Jones. I'm basically the US version of Nick. I've produced something called the Better World Shopping Guide, a little book, and it has rankings of companies from A to F based on all the publicly available information, kind of boiled down into a very simple interface for people. And there's an iPod version as well, and it's about trying to teach people how to vote with their dollars.
An iPhone version.
Yeah, iPhone. What did I say?
iPod.
iPod. Well, it does work on the iPod. It does. It doesn't, and it even works on the iPad, but it doesn't work well on the iPad. That's the iPad's problem.
I'm Jonathan Melhuish. I organise these kind of things for fun. I also run an organisation called 9 Carrots with Ainsley, promoting ethical consumerism on a very local level, working with small businesses to increase their energy efficiency. And I'm hoping to continue working in this field and supporting ethical consumerism, if we can say it.
I'm Terry Newholm, based at Manchester Business School, and I co-edited the book, The Ethical Consumer, in 2005, and it's now getting a bit outdated, but I don't get time to update it. Would like to.
It's still good. I used it in class last semester.
Thank you.
We have to as a fan.
All of these books are available on the website.
Promotion break. Have you got the book, Dorothea?
Coming up, I'm sure. No, my name is Dorothea Kleine. I'm a geographer and I teach on ethical consumption and fair trade at Royal Holloway, which is a college at the University of London. And I'm also researching in this area, hoping to do a project together with Terry and Deirdre and just come out of a project which was all about tracing value chains with the use of technology, RFID or barcode, and tracing that through. So it was called Fair Tracing, and the website is fairtracing.org. And the idea was really to trace fair trade Chilean wine and Indian shade-grown coffee all the way through to the UK consumer, and then allow the consumer to look at the smartphone and find out about where their products have come from, but also about the value chain in between. Ideally, who got what in terms of the money, where it was going, and who was involved, and their practices.
Last but not least.
I'm Ainsley. I work with Jonathan on 9 Carrots. We also work on Easy Ethical, which is a community-built ethical information resource.
Maybe we could start off with, we've been having some conversations today in the restaurant, with perhaps just introducing some of the topics that we feel we're kind of addressing in our projects currently. Use that as a starting point for the discussion.
I'm probably going to say the same things everyone else.
We'll have to think of you, Andy. We'll get more difficult as we go.
First, I suppose most people are overwhelmed by the plethora of issues connected with the supply chains of their everyday products. And so part of some of the things we talked about over lunch was trying to navigate through that minefield and give people tools that are useful to allow them to make choices ahead in a certain direction. We sort of alluded to the fact also that there wasn't one ethical pathway or more sustainable pathway. It actually was different according to what we valued. So for the vegan, that might be a great choice, but there's a whole lot of other areas of that person's life that that may have different things that they're still working on.
So basically, encouraging people and facilitating people in thinking more generally about the issues surrounding a product, not just their specific area of interest.
Yeah, I definitely agree with the wider issues, but what we try to do is emphasise that the starting place is actually the things that we value. Yeah. So there might be animal issues for some people, there might be social issues and thinking about where your cocoa and your chocolate comes from for someone else. So starting with the things that actually you're passionate about.
I'm working from that.
Yeah, it's hard to talk about any of these issues in ethical consumerism without opening up the whole can of worms. So I think about, this is so complicated. I mean, the average person that's going into a supermarket or going into a mall or even taking a trip and needing an airline ticket, the issues are so complex in the first place. The choices are so diluted through things like greenwashing and corporate attempts to make themselves look good because they don't actually want to change, and then there are companies that are actually doing good but they don't know how to communicate that they're doing that good thing, and then there are these different issues, and you go with the fair trade or the organic, and so this average person that's just out there has to be so confused and torn, and it's like we're creating a system to make them want to drop out of the whole ethical consumption idea, right? Because, I've said this a few times before in the past. I've been working on these issues for a couple of decades now. I have trouble. And this is all I do. All I do is research these companies and ethical choices and try to make things easy for people, and I have a tough time when I go out and I buy a loaf of bread or an airline ticket or walk into a supermarket. It's tough. And so it really is, it's not impossible, it's tough. It's about making things easy. It's about really kind of consciously battling the greenwashing that's out there, because it is very powerful and well-funded. And really, so making that clear for people, because it's muddy right now to make the choices clear. And it's also about not beating either ourselves up or each other up, right? Because, I'm vegan, but, you volunteer your time, so I beat you up for not being a vegan, and you beat me up for not being a volunteer. And, that kind of stuff, we really have to take a much more kind of compassionate, flexible approach to ourselves and each other to get through this intact.
Yeah, so I guess that comes back to what you were saying about that starting point, building on what people already do and emphasising that positive aspect of what they do care about, and working from there rather than focusing on negative stuff.
I like the idea of concentrating on specific easy wins, like the 10 words. But almost everyone, these companies are so hideous, no one's going to really say, and actually saying, just avoid these lot as a first step. I think that can be.
I guess the only risk with kind of simplifying things down to, here are 10 companies you can avoid, or here are 5 things you can do to make your home energy efficient, tends to be just like these easy, quick first steps, and then people think, oh, okay, I've finished now, I've done it, I'm a good person. I guess that's what I was going to say, is that what really interests me is how can you motivate people over a long term to change their behaviour and to maybe even change their attitudes towards things.
Just a point, John, but if we could persuade everybody to go for the 10,
yeah,
that would make a hell of a difference.
True.
That's what I'd like to go to
Yes.
aims here. I don't think the aim is to get people to ethically consume. The aim is to get companies to change. Now, if like Terry says, if those 10 companies really got it in the neck, then they would certainly be convinced that there was a marketplace out there for being properly ethical. And I think
Plus every other
capitalism
company.
and free markets would actually proactively change itself and go to that market. So I don't think we need to get everyone to ethically consume, or indeed on all the time.
And this is what I think long term, where this whole movement hopefully will be heading, is the more I've been working on this, the more I think more about this idea of an economic version of democracy. That it's not necessarily when you cast your vote and how or who you or what I value and what you value, but if we can open up a communication system, like by definition, the companies will listen to the dollars. They are listening there. And when the dollars come in by them doing something, then they do more of that thing. And when they stop coming in, then they do less of that thing. And they're great at it, which is why they're so successful. But we're the ones that hold the dollars, for the most part, 70 or 80% of them anyway. We're the ones that hold those votes. And if we can ultimately convince consumers that they are voters, and that those dollars are doing much more than just buying them a good flavor, or a healthy lunch, or a completely unhealthy lunch, or whatever it is, and that line of communication can be heard directly by the companies, and they know they'll be held accountable like politicians are held accountable, then at least, technically, then at least we have like a system in place that that communication can create that change.
Actually, I think it's very interesting to kind of question which lever is the most powerful to kind of go for, because I think I like what you said earlier about not beating each other up. Even if we decide individually that personally we think this is the lever to go for, while others think this is the lever to go for. So, I think I've done this for fair trade, kind of thought about sort of fair trade as a model which works on a macro level, which kind of thinks about global trade. Yeah, I wish it did more, but it used to. Then a meso level where you kind of think about company policy, where you think about business practice, and then a micro level where you think about individual projects, individual producers, or individual consumers. And a lot of sort of work needs to be done around, how can we motivate people on a micro level to make those, everyday decisions and change routines, for example. Then there needs to be questions, research needs to be done, but also kind of practical examples at this meso level about how to do business differently. And I think this is also where small and medium enterprises and some of these ethical, star businesses that don't communicate very well sometimes come in, because they show how it could be done. And then at a sort of a macro level, I don't think we should give up on proper democracy, as in democracy of votes, one vote per head, to actually implement some regulation and regulate some stuff. So I think there are these different levels to kind of work on. And I think one thing that we can learn from the experience of the fair trade section was that there's been this huge shift away from, discussing world trade rules. They've kind of lost the focus on macro. There's still some companies who do it differently on the meso level, and some of the big players have shifted their behavior, which was, made in terms of turnover a huge difference. And then there's, the big story about ethical consumption on the micro level that has changed. But I think, so fair trade has been successful in working on the micro level and changing people's behavior, and it's been successful at shifting, making business practices that were the domain of the kind of small, medium-sized stars more common across other companies. But I think it lost the focus on the regulatory level and on sort of questioning the rules of world trade. And I think in a way, ethical consumption is the bigger category here. And to me, it can learn something about what fair trade did in terms of making it easier to change behavior at the micro level, etc. but I don't think we should forget about that macro level, regulatory change. You know, what happens if you want countries with the kind of key consumer markets internally basically change some of the things that they expect from their companies, etc. Because yes, we live in a world where multinationals operate multinationally, but that consumers are still in particular national cultures, and their understanding of what is fair or isn't is crucial in terms of how they negotiate their relationship with that company, and that's what they're after, these companies, you know, kind of, you know, building a community around their brand. So that's another angle to take, I think.
Sure.
There's lots and lots there. One thing that comes to mind is I'd love to see multinationals taking responsibility for their impact and minimising that, cleaning up their act. But at the same time, I think the solutions are actually in different places than those large companies actually just becoming the greenest. So an example that's hit us recently in Australia is, obviously Cadbury has gone fair trade with their dairy milk brand. It's coming to supermarkets since Easter this year. And that's fantastic because it means consumers can get a relatively cheap 250 gram block. Fair trade is accessible in terms of chocolate for people now. But what it's done, it's replaced the 100 gram block by a group called Coca-Cola, who's a local Melbourne-based firm who's providing exclusively fair trade chocolate through the supermarkets. And what it's done is now Cadbury has all of the fair trade market in the supermarkets, and they've lost their market. Australia's quite unique because it has the most concentrated supermarket grocery concentration in the world. 80% is owned by two players, and therefore, if you're not in the supermarket, if you're not in those two chains, supermarket chains, you don't have a market in Australia. So, to some extent, what we're encouraging is people to actually think about best choices within the present systems, and often it is multinationals who are in the supermarkets, but also look beyond to some of the local alternatives that are actually probably the real ways forward in terms of supporting local systems.
It's one of the things we like about 9 Carrots, obviously. It does bring people back to their local community shops to work with them, to get to know them and strengthen the community. So yeah, I think that's important. There's a whole host of issues here. It's not just about multinationals. You shop with where you shop.
It does bring up, I think, another interesting point that comes back to the democracy, which I don't see as just an issue of consumers communicating with the corporations. I mean, I do appreciate the comment about that we need regular democracy to work. In fact, I think we need democracy, that kind of template, to function in all spheres, not just political and economic, but as much as possible in social and cultural, and so if we could get more of that. And part of, I think, the original brilliance of the idea of the democracy is that it's a way to disperse power. That what it did replace were these like top-down oligarchies or monarchies or so forth, where the power is all up here and then everybody else doesn't have any. And that comes about, this power accumulation comes about when different institutions begin to accumulate more and more and more power. And the kind of inherent advantage of a democracy, when it's working properly, is that it won't allow power to accumulate. It keeps power dispersed rather than having it accumulate at these small elite groups. And one of the things that happens, I think, when we see this shift in the economy that is happening towards more and more concentrated power, economic power in multinationals, is that we see this kind of anti-democracy, this kind of oligarchy of economy happening. And it comes back to when I think more about local and when, all these years of rating companies, there's this trend that's very easy to see, and that is the larger you get as a company, the more difficult it is for you to actually go green in a proper way. So you could get a fair trade Cadbury here or this there, but then if you look at the basic kind of belly of the beast, it's still doing awful things all over the world, including like a Walmart that can go over here and do these wonderful programs that can get all kinds of. But the inherent nature of the beast is it's too big because it has too much power, and that power needs to be dispersed. And that's the brilliance of local, independent, co-op, farmer, all of those little things that have been emphasized since the 60s or before, right? Is that idea that if we could keep these little centers, they're just inherently more responsible and greener. Now, that it doesn't mean that they will by definition be, because you can have a local independent business that's doing bad things too. But by definition, it's very, very difficult for you to get a benevolent dictator in the economic sphere. It's just not a part of that realm.
Yeah. I think I'd like to make the unpleasant point that I don't think we are making enough of a significant difference to actually solve any of the problems in time. Climate change is going to kick in massively, I know climate change is quite wrong, but it's going to kick in massively before we have wide-ranging economic design. I don't see it increasing at any heavy, immediate rate in a way that is going to stop complete destruction of the planet's ecosystems. Living in a green, of course, but we need to.
We've just lost our entire audience.
The one person that was watching. All right.
He's watching from his phone in a fried chicken shop.
That was good to
Suffice to say, there's not a bicycle shop in the green. Can't find a health food shop. Can't find anything in.
So you're not beef.
Yeah. Anyway, back to the point. I think one of the key things that we need to talk about is how we massively expand the number of people that are doing this, and importantly, how we massively expand it across cultural boundaries. So we've managed to get some readers, people from that culture getting on board, because that is a huge part of society. And I think we need to really kind of work out how we expand the movement out.
You're right. It takes more than people cleaning up their act to actually fix the problem, because the business motive is one of profits, and profits are connected with reducing expenses, which is usually in terms of labour or resource extraction, heavy footprint. So the whole business model needs to sort of be turned on its head and take on some different definitions of success. So I'm inputting into my community, I'm providing a certain amount of employment. That's part of the definition for a successful business. It should be. But I suppose I think all of the projects here are entry points. What they're doing is they're raising onto the agenda a whole lot of different issues for people to connect with consumption, with their purchases, which isn't happening. They're not making those connections between the wider impact. So just by it being in people's mind is a really positive thing, and sort of invites a dialogue about some of the deeper issues, like how much is enough to live well? What does it take for us to live a good life? And do I actually need this purchase in the first place? It's all part of the mix.
Yeah, interesting point from Ainsley also about time horizons, because a colleague of mine, myself, we've just done some work with students who'd gone with us. They'd taken a second year kind of development theories course and then spent 10 days in rural Kenya, and basically without electricity, with very limited water supply, etc. And we then invited some of them to a kind of just a small focus group to kind of talk about, okay, consumption habits, what do you need, what's important, does any of this impact, given that you've now been in a sort of, you've been in a place where resources really mattered, did that change any of your habits? And frankly, was the whole trip with your 1.3 tons of carbon that it costs to transport you over there, and the £1,000 that you paid, was that worth it? In that sense, can you justify it? And what we found, well, this is kind of not written down yet, but it's kind of coming out, it's basically this idea that the students had, in the micro understanding, oh, well, buy more fair trade, and maybe I'll kind of, stop the water while I wash my hands and things like that. And the micro things, there's room for negotiation. But actually, when we said, well, what about the 1.3 tons of carbon that you spent traveling there? Oh, I don't think about that because, I travel so much and I fly to Florida for holidays and things, it doesn't really come into the equation. And these are geography students in the UK who, at a fair trade university with, me proselytizing at them for a bit. And where basically the big things that aren't really up for negotiation. And it did shock me because this is the future. And this some of the kind of tertiary sector educated people in particular subjects, it's already a skewed sample. And yet, habits are not likely to change with them. So in terms of the time horizon, this is really worrying. And my colleague afterwards kind of said, if we do this with democracy, I'm not sure we're actually going to change that, and kind of, set up this big heresy of saying, well, if the Chinese government decides to change the way the Chinese growth path will happen, then something's going to change much faster than until the British public will actually change their flying habits. And I was shocked at the idea that we would, question the idea of democracy or democratic rule in this way. But the point about time horizons is crucial. And my only contribution to this, and I'm still reeling from this conversation, is that one of the things that needs to come into the equation is the issue of social acceptability and social pressure, and how whatever gadgets we introduce on iPods, iPhones, whatever, if it helps to create thinking, but also change norms of thinking, that would really push things a bit further. Because if you think how much an iPhone itself or an iPod itself is moving towards becoming a social norm, or the use of such a gadget is becoming a social norm. If you could somehow piggyback on that, I think there's some interesting stories about diffusion of social norms going on that might be a possibility.
We go around in circles because we start off by saying we shouldn't beat each other up, and now we're saying the only way is to beat each other up. There is a sense in which, up until recently, we've been really, really careful. So someone says, they've flown on a holiday, or look at my nice, like a neighbour does. I've got this lovely new car, and you're just going to go. Whereas in the old days you'd say, lift the bonnet up, let's have a look, and now you say, right. And they sort of begin to notice that. But unless there is some conversation about this, and I'm going to get beaten up with other people as well, but unless there is a conversation going on.
Terry flew down here from Manchester.
I did reply to that. Trying to ruin my credibility. But yeah, I think there's a real tension there. Yeah, unless you discuss these things, then...
Well, like say us from Melhuish, Australia. You've got the ferry, didn't you?
Yeah, the ferry from the US, the direct ferry from Boston.
The ferry, really?
No, it would be impossible.
The kayak, it was mostly kayak.
Not carbon in the production of kayaks.
I sequestered the kayak after I was done with it.
Dorothea and I are going to be looking into the pleasure in this, and I think that's one of the things I was reading in one of the books, and actually you can laugh about it because you know, there are a lot of things in this that really are quite fun when you talk about them. And we were going to say, you know, so because a lot of it is kind of very dour, isn't it? Oh, you can't do this anymore, you can't do that anymore, you mustn't buy these sort of things. But actually, yeah, when we did interviews in the kind of very early part, there were some consumers that saw themselves as ethical that took it incredibly seriously. And it was all very down. And there are others that were saying, do you know, sometimes I go in and I only buy organic, and then other times I don't. It's hilarious, really funny. You know, they enjoyed the sort of the game of it to an extent. But you know, if we haven't got time, game's up. But it is strange how there is a serious and funny side to it.
I think all this discussion essentially is quite heavy philosophy, really. I find this decision whenever I'm faced with a set of bananas that's gone halfway around the world and it's fair trade.
Yes.
I just find it amusing because there's no solution to that. It's no
yeah, but that one ran and ran, didn't it? Because first of all, I know you can't grow bananas here very easily. Yes. Well, you could if you had, you know, very hot conditions. Yes. But the first thing was don't buy them because you know, they've been flown halfway around the world and that's terrible. And then another lot of guys came in and said, okay, we've done the calculations. If they were made here, our farmers want holidays abroad, they want big cars, all these things, and their footprint is huge. The farmers where they're being grown, the footprint is low, and if you calculate the whole thing, you ought to buy bananas. Okay, and then someone came along and said, okay, but growing the bananas in this poor country, you know, parts of Africa or whatever, where they're very low on water, you're actually importing water from Africa to, you know, where we were, which is Manchester, which notoriously is not short of water. So this argument just kept going, bouncing backwards and forwards, and you got the feeling that, you know, let a bunch of academics free, and this thing is never going to end. No, so it brings us back to the one about, you know, how do you make the decisions on this, because they seem to keep reversing.
There's also that, I mean, that's to draw the connection between the two. I mean, we were talking about making these decisions clear in some way. I guess that's the main thrust of many of the projects, but also there's this question of, is it an enjoyable process? Is it enjoyable to be an ethical consumer? Do I get some kind of reward from that?
I think one of the things that really sticks out from also the fair trade experience is that there are different national trajectories on this. Though even though we live in a kind of sort of in some context transnational culture space, there are particular national trajectories. So this idea of, you know, enjoying your ethical consumption, there might be either national or sort of youth cultures, for example, or subcultures which basically, for example, enjoy a gaming kind of approach and who will enjoy getting points for a particular shopping thing. And, you know, similar to a bit to what 9 Carrots wants to do, etc. Also kind of getting a sense of challenge in there. And that will work for some. I think there'll be others, sort of national cultures where, you know, angsting, angst is a German word, and the kind of worry about decisions, etc., is almost part of kind of, you know, dinner talk and social conversation. So the idea of making a shopping decision easily or quick, or just running down the cereal aisle and just buying whatever, isn't potentially as, you know, as normal in that particular cultural context. So, and again, there'll be others where quick and easy is the way to go, etc. What strikes me is that across national cultures, something like bargain hunting has been quite successful for some, and price is this immensely powerful tool to simplify decisions one way or another. And I'm very interested in say, carbon labeling, with kind of putting numbers to this as well, because if one were to have, say, a carbon price, an abstraction as it is, then that would be, for me, one of the first times we're actually going to see something similar as a powerful kind of abstraction, as a market price, as an economic price there. So, set academics free, but I think that there is this issue about how can you on the one hand tap into particular existing drivers of people as collectives, as subgroups, as nations, as cultures, problematic as these terms are. And on the other hand, what are some universal shortcuts that lots of people on the planet use, like, for example, price?
I'm going to say what I say every time. Apologies, and it's the fourth time already.
We don't have time.
I really. I'm saying it's not that one. It's a positive one.
Rephrase positively.
I really enjoy discussing philosophy. I think a lot of people enjoy shouting about their opinions. I went on a philosophy site recently and was arguing with someone about.
Put your arm down, no one can see you.
I went to a philosophy site recently.
And a couple of people started debating it with me in quite a civilised manner actually, and I went back and back every day to see the next comment. Really, really super interested, and I actually enjoy the discussions we're having today. And talking about things, making your opinion felt, is a hugely engaging thing, and it is something that we can tap into and utilise. At the moment, the entire ethical consumer movement has no interest in that. If I'm an ethical consumer, then all of these things have no interest in my opinion, my knowledge, my extreme excitement about the possibility of discussing these things. No one wants to know. And when there's, I think maybe Ellis, you were talking about it, when there's a site which dictates scores down to people, some of them go there, some of them leave. It's never been successful. The comment area underneath, with people's opinions on it, was huge, because that excites them enough to get involved. And no one is doing that at the moment. If you tap into that excitement, I think you can spread this to a degree that you will have a huge movement. But you will have to accept a different model for the generation of information. You have to come from them. I believe that can work, but it means giving up control.
I agree totally with what you say. It taps into the framing of the whole thing as being a positive thing as opposed to a negative thing, as not being a downer. All of this, making decisions, is hard work by ourselves. It is a minefield. But when you're working together and celebrating those good buys, the finds that you find, and you go, wow, this is local and organic and doesn't have labour issues, and blah, blah, blah. The best buys, when people get excited about that and they start sharing that to each other, suddenly it's sort of a win-win on lots of levels. So that's kind of the movement that I see that's being engendered at the moment.
I think that's a really interesting one, because my response to what Ainsley was saying was also that I think we need to be aware of sort of simplifying over across of different user preferences or individual preferences. So there'll be people who enjoy complexity, and there'll be people who want quick answers. Life is complicated enough. I've got relationship issues. I don't want to think about this. Just tell me what I'm supposed to buy for shit. I think maybe that's off the agenda, but partnership's still running okay. But that's why I have time to discuss this stuff. No, but one of the things is basically if people are under pressure in all kinds of ways, then maybe what they want is simple answers, or at least some of them. Now, Best Buys, I think, is an interesting one, because here you get two things. The people who want to share, who enjoy being kind of, talking about particular products, can talk about it as much as they want to, and at the same time, the people who want simplicity, get an answer.
Yeah.
They're like, here, buy that and be happy. You don't have to worry about the rest. This is a good one. And that's so precious in an area where complexity is rife. Having a few, these are surefire ones. People are so grateful if there are some guilt-free purchases, because the other one is basically managing guilt. And how do you manage guilt, and how do you weigh that up against complexity versus simplicity?
Well, it seems like the one of the nicest approaches I've seen. It hasn't always been implemented perfectly, but has an incredibly simple interface, and then another behind it that's a little more complex, and another more complex, and finally all of the dirty details for the real kind of research hounds. And when that is in place, as long as the front, as long as the very front is as simple as you can imagine, it includes like 10 best and 10 worst and Best Buy and so forth. As long as it's that easy, I think that that system is really a positive one.
Yeah.
But I wanted to get back to that idea of like a carbon label that has the carbon price on it. And I think this is in some ways the crux of the whole issue. And maybe this is because I'm a sociologist and we're always talking about making the invisible world visible, right? All the invisible structures that control our lives, all the strings that are around us that we constantly ignore, and in fact they're more powerful often than our own individual preferences and choices in guiding and predicting behavior. But I think that at a very basic level, the problem with the ethical consumption idea is that the structures have been set up to obscure so well the realities, so that when you look at a product, it just looks simply like this wonderful thing that has just kind of materialized before you from the netherworld, and you're just like, ooh, what a lovely flavor that is, and then you move on from there, rather than actually revealing all of the realities that this particular product has taken part in. And many of them are incredibly dark realities, right? I literally don't think anybody would eat seafood if you just saw, if you could experience at some level how close we are to the cliff of the seafood, ecosystem collapse, how all the seafood is harvested, all the kind of trash fish and all the ecosystems that are destroyed in that our current system is just like wrecking havoc. If they could get a sense of that at all, I think we'd have a lot of people in the world that are just like not ever eating seafood until the system was replaced.
I don't think we have anyone going into a supermarket full stop.
Yeah, and so, but one of the things with and it's very simple, but I think it is exactly the first step that needs to take place, but just something simple like a little carbon label that says, oh, here's the carbon footprint, for example, of this particular product. As soon as you have that little tiny peek into this huge world, and it's not a very dark peak, it's not like you're seeing a little child dying on the label or anything. It's a very small peak, a number that has a little price. Well, that opens the door for the next thing. Like maybe the local city says, you know what, we're going to tax all those by 1 penny or 1/10 of a penny per, and that'll be our decision, just a little local thing. But as soon as you make it real and people recognize it as a real thing, even if it's not a part of an institutional set of sticks and carrots necessarily, it opens the door for unveiling and dealing with these different layers of reality. Because if you actually open the floodgates all at once, you just get the depressed people that are suddenly overwhelmed, which is what we're good at in sociology. We're good at creating depressed graduates. But if you open the door little by little and hand a little empowerment here, a little label there, and pretty soon I think you can actually build up a kind of powerful and empowered consumer, realizing that they can participate in creating this better system, and then these Best Buys become not just guilt alleviation, but also like a feeling of, I'm really helping this little business, and I'm helping these people, and I feel like I'm part of something really meaningful.
That's where I find this gaming thing really interesting, because the only thing that worries me about carbon labelling, for instance, is that because it's based on numbers and CO2 or whatever the chemical formula is, it comes across as something a bit technical. Whereas if you're more like those, what are they called, playing cards, what are they called, when you compare two different things and one of you wins. Somebody back me up. They do exist.
Yeah. Pokemon.
Fish? No.
Is it not?
Games cards. They have gaming cards.
Oh, wait, collect the cards.
Two cards.
Two sports cards.
Trump. Okay.
Yeah.
The girl.
That's really good. I think. So you get two sports cars and you go, this one's got a bigger engine, and then I win.
Yeah.
So yeah, if you
It's
can,
very much like consumption culture.
yeah, exactly. Or if you can do that, if you can introduce some kind of competitive element, either between people or between products, so you actually, oh, this washing powder has a lower carbon footprint. You know, that's kind of fun. And if we can get people into that, then that seems like a way to get them more interested. Maybe it's not really communicating the kind of reality of the story of that product, and maybe that needs something a bit more visceral, a bit more visual perhaps. But it's a kind of interesting hook to get people involved.
That's what you said too, Ellis. What that also does, that little label that identifies a different criteria for purchasing this product, at the business end, it raises the bar of what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. So basically what you're saying, if all products in a particular line had a carbon footprint rating on them, then obviously it's raising consumers' awareness, but it's also saying eventually those with the lower ones are going to drop away, and therefore, sorry, the higher ones are going to drop away, and therefore companies are going to be striving to reduce their carbon footprint. So putting things in the public sphere like that is really helpful.
I'm just also sort of struck. We'll get back to. We don't have time. But I think that there's an issue here about our assumptions about people, and people's choices, and it's as though even in our conversation we're kind of wavering between kind of ideas that are drummed into us about people using their brain to make these decisions, and ideas of gut reaction, lots of different kind of emotions, etc. And one of the interesting things when we kind of talk, for example, about gaming, kind of feelings of competitiveness combined with facts on trump cards, is how those two things kind of overlap, kind of cold statistics and feelings of competitiveness. So I think there's some interesting things going on if we allow ourselves to move away from a model that's been very prominent in parts of economics, I would say large parts of economics, rational choice ideas, and to some degree also parts of sociology, parts of geography that kind of are very brain focused. When the reality is a lot of companies spend a lot of money trying to get their products out there by focusing on emotions.
Absolutely.
And we're crazy to kind of move in, just because a lot of people who think about ethical consumption like to play around their in their kind of intellectual worlds, etc. To focus so much on reason and rationality and intellect, when actually consumption happens so much also on an emotional level. And we have to find spaces in which we allow ourselves to think about that as well, and we need to find a language for that.
Totally, and I think one of the... Sorry, no, you were next.
Sure.
I really agree with Dorothea. I think that's a very good point. The EU recently voted against compulsory labelling of GM foods throughout Europe. I don't know, I think it was a couple of years ago. And I've forgotten the answer.
I'll pick up. Yeah, I mean, I agree, because we toyed with ideas. When we
sort of peer pressure. I think it's not just the person. If all their friends start doing something, it's the social interaction that can cause behaviour change.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, we toyed with some of the ideas of kind of what shifts people's ideas and behaviour, and one of them was this kind of idea of the emotional thing that happens. And so with your kind of interactive websites where consumers speak to each other, they do tend to be more emotive, don't they? Our websites are, we give you, facts, and we're very careful not to say you must buy this, you must buy that. But these open websites are like, you buy from Lowe's, the company. they tend to be very emotive, and they're more like you were saying with the, if you really knew that we were on the edge of destroying all these fish and you're not going to have them anymore anyway, big hit, you would begin to think about it, wouldn't you? And it's so I do agree with you. I think it's a huge place for sort of saying things quite emotionally. The problem with that, of course, is that it's not always based on well-researched things, and so you have tension.
I was going to say, what we really need is to move from, because I still think that idea of having bits of transparency are really important, but we need to move from getting the bit, so like the number, the carbon number, to professional, ethical consumer marketers, like teams that would be basically be able to create something that was not just numbers, but was also like evocative colors, so that you could immediately see like these all have little black labels on them or little red labels, and you easily get to the green ones and the blue ones and the ones that are, and also like little design pieces, so that we could actually use marketing as, instead of a way just to manipulate people to buy products that they wouldn't otherwise buy, or quantities that they wouldn't otherwise buy, into ways to really at a gut level reach people and get them to begin to shift over, not just on the informational level, but also a little bit on the emotional level.
I think there's a difference between marketing 1.1 and marketing 2.0. I have a friend who is very right-wing. His friends, this is basically the social pressure in, but his friends were mostly vegetarian, mostly left-wing, but nothing was really happening in terms of that referential group. What's changed recently is that his friends, including myself, have become far more vocal about it. And he's had to change, because he's hanging around people who constantly advocate these things. And he's changed radically from right-wing towards, last comment was, I can see why vegetarianism is the right thing, which is an enormous change, but it was because the people around him suddenly started becoming very much more advocates of the whole thing. I think there are a lot of people out there that kind of do this, but to some degree they do it in some ways that is silent. And I think turning those people into far more advocates and giving them ownership of these systems is the key to spreading it from person to person, group, professional, group to group.
So again, we've been around in the circle. From we shouldn't beat ourselves up to, we should be more outspoken.
And the counter example I have for that is, I had a potluck group back in Davis that went on for years, and it included, at least at the beginning, a couple that were vegan, a couple that were vegetarian, and a couple who just ate anything. And
Potluck groups.
a potluck, everybody brings food for the dinner, yeah. And for years, we had this group, and everyone was basically forced to do vegan cooking on that night, for the most part, because you didn't want to bring meat over to the vegans or the vegetarians' house necessarily, or sit there and eat it while we were all sitting together. And it became this, we all became excellent vegan cooks, And I think it has changed. It it didn't convert everyone into vegans, that's for certain. But it did change, we were the vegetarian couple, so we are the vegetarian. And so we do know how to and create more delicious vegan options. And so do the people who are eating meat, and I suspect they're eating significantly less than they would have if they never ended up with the friends who we almost never spoke about. Every now and then the vegan would make a very lighthearted joke about the cheese or something on the table. Other than that, it was good.
Well, it's very interesting because we know from pedagogy that basically people respond to criticism a lot stronger than praise. However, I do think that in order not to depress ourselves, because we cannot agree, at present, as say a ethical consumption interest group cannot agree what is ethical consumption. Instead of to depress ourselves, to say, we're all on a speed train to nowhere anyways, or B, kind of saying, and I'm not pointing fingers because let that leave that internal to the family. But secondly, we can't say where we want the train to go. So, and this is where the metaphor needs to break down. But basically, we need to decide to say, okay, let's praise steps that we think are vaguely in the right direction when we don't know the goal. We don't know exactly where we're going, but we know where we want to get away from. And so praising, reinforcing, but also kind of, excitement, stuff, trying out new stuff, just getting other people in a safe space to try out new stuff is great. And I think this is sort of what maybe this kind of the pleasure idea could also kind of tap into, is kind of, for some people actually experiencing, sort of new stuff or different kind of experiences can be quite, just interesting. And even if that means, small steps in the right direction, that's possibly the best that you can think